The night Adu tried to walk away from his inheritance, 7 men reminded him that his life was never his to begin with. By sunrise, his bank accounts were frozen, his protection withdrawn, and a single message was left on his door. Choose the circle or be buried outside it. What Adu didn't know was that the cult he feared was already written into his blood, long before he was born. This is the story of a man who inherited a fortune and discovered it was a contract he never signed. A story of wealth that came with chains, of power that demanded submission, and of a choice that would define not just his life, but the lives of everyone trapped in the same web of control and fear. Adu was born into a world most people only dream of. Private drivers waited at gates that opened without questions. His family name carried weight in rooms where decisions were made, and fortunes were shifted with a single word. His grandfather had been a powerful man, the kind whose presence commanded silence and whose absence left echoes. His father inherited that same quiet authority, the kind that made people lower their voices and choose their words carefully. Adu enjoyed the privileges without questioning their source: private schools, international travel, connections that opened doors before he even knocked. He believed his family's wealth came from legitimate business, old money passed down through generations of hard work and careful investment. He wore expensive clothes, drove luxury cars, and moved through life with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything. But even in his comfort, there were signs he chose not to see. The way certain people treated his father with a mixture of respect and fear. The way conversations would stop when Adu entered rooms where elders gathered. The way his father would disappear for days without explanation, returning quieter and more distant each time. Adu told himself it was just the burden of responsibility, the weight of managing family affairs. He prided himself on being different from his father and grandfather, modern, educated, unburdened by whatever traditions they carried. He believed he could enjoy the wealth without inheriting the shadows that seemed to follow his family name. Then his father died. The funeral was attended by hundreds, but Adu noticed something strange. Among the mourners were faces he didn't recognize, men and women dressed in dark clothing who didn't weep or pay respects the way others did. They observed, they watched, they waited. That night after the burial, after the guests had left and the house had fallen silent, there was a knock at the door. Adu opened it to find 3 elderly men standing in the darkness, their faces calm, but their eyes carrying an authority that made his breath catch. One of them stepped forward, his silver hair catching the light from inside. His name was Elder Kagiso, and his voice carried the kind of certainty that made disagreement feel impossible. "We need to speak with you," he said. Not a request, a command. They entered without waiting for permission, and Adu felt something shift in the air, something he couldn't name but could feel pressing against his chest. They sat in his father's study, in chairs that seemed to belong to them more than to Adu. And Kagiso spoke with the patience of someone who had delivered this speech before. "Your father is gone. The seat he held cannot remain empty. You will take his place." Adu stared at them, confusion mixing with growing unease. "I don't understand. What seat? What are you talking about?" Kagiso leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "Your grandfather helped found something greater than business, greater than wealth, a circle of power that has protected this family for 3 generations. Your father rose high within it, and now it falls to you." Adu felt his stomach tighten. "A circle? You mean a cult?" The word hung in the air like smoke. Kagiso smiled without warmth. "Call it what you wish, but understand this. The wealth you enjoy, the protection you've lived under, the doors that open for you, none of it is yours by accident. It is custodianship, not inheritance. You don't own the wealth. The wealth owns you." Adu's hands began to shake. He had heard rumors, whispers about secret societies and powerful groups that controlled things from the shadows. He had dismissed them as superstition, the kind of stories people told to explain what they didn't understand. But now those whispers had names and faces, and they were sitting in his father's study, telling him his life had never been his own. "What if I refuse?" he asked, his voice barely steady. The men exchanged glances. Kagiso's expression didn't change. "Then you walk away with nothing. No wealth, no protection, no name. Everything you've known will disappear like it never existed, and you will learn what it means to stand alone in a world that does not forgive weakness." Adu felt trapped. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. "I need time to think," he said. Kagiso stood, and the others followed. "You have until the next full moon. After that, the decision will be made for you." They left as quietly as they had come, and Adu sat alone in the darkness, feeling the weight of an inheritance he never asked for, pressing down on him like a stone. The days that followed were torture. Adu couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think about anything except the choice laid before him. He tried to learn more about the cult his grandfather had founded. He searched online, asked careful questions, listened to rumors. What he found terrified him. Stories of manipulation of people who crossed the cult and lost everything. Stories of rituals that bound members through fear and obligation. Stories of punishment for those who tried to leave. But there were other stories too. Stories of protection, of justice served when the law failed, of communities held together by bonds stronger than blood. The cult was feared, yes, but it was also respected in ways that made Adu's head spin. He wanted to walk away. Every instinct told him to run, to take whatever small portion of his wealth he could carry and disappear into a new life where his name carried no weight and his blood carried no debt. But he also couldn't imagine losing everything. The comfort, the security, the power that came with being part of something larger than himself. He tried to find a middle path. He contacted the elders and proposed a compromise. "I'll fund your projects," he said. "I'll support from a distance. But I won't join the rituals. I won't take the oaths." The response came through a messenger, a young woman with cold eyes who delivered the words without emotion. "The circle does not accept spectators. You are in or you are out. There is no middle ground." That night, Adu's privileges began to disappear. Associates who had always answered his calls suddenly became unavailable. Business deals that seemed certain collapsed without explanation. His bank received inquiries about irregularities in his accounts. His driver quit without notice. His friends stopped inviting him to gatherings. It wasn't revenge. It was policy. The cult was showing him exactly what life outside the circle looked like, and it looked like falling through ice into dark water with nothing to grab onto. Adu realized he had no choice. Not really. The illusion of choice had been stripped away, leaving only the truth. He had been marked from birth, claimed before he could speak, promised before he could understand what promises meant. He contacted the elders and told them he would join. They didn't celebrate. They simply nodded and told him when to appear. "If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Subscribe now and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent." The initiation was nothing like he expected. There was no blood sacrifice, no dark ceremony in hidden chambers. Instead, he was brought to a simple room where 12 members sat in a circle, their faces illuminated by candlelight. Kagiso sat at the head, his presence dominating the space, even in silence. They asked him questions about his fears, his ambitions, his understanding of power. They told him the history of the cult, how it had been founded to protect families that had no other protection, to enforce justice when the law turned a blind eye, to build wealth and influence that could shield communities from exploitation. "We are not what the stories say," Kagiso told him, his eyes never leaving Adu's face. "We are what survival required us to become." Adu was given a choice. He could walk away now, broke and unprotected, with his dignity intact. Or he could join and observe without authority, learning the ways of the circle before being trusted with real power. He chose to stay, not out of belief, but out of survival. He expected chaos. He expected cruelty. What he found was far more complicated. The cult operated like a shadow government, with rules and hierarchies and systems of accountability that were both ancient and frighteningly efficient. Many of the rituals were symbolic, designed to reinforce loyalty rather than serve any practical purpose. Fear sustained power more than violence ever could. The threat of punishment was often more effective than punishment itself. And Adu discovered something that disturbed him deeply. Many members used the ancient laws not to protect their communities, but to bully rivals and intimidate civilians. They wielded the cult's authority like a weapon, twisting rules meant for justice into tools of personal vengeance. Kagiso himself seemed to embody this philosophy. In meetings, he would invoke ancient precedents to silence dissent, use fear of expulsion to control votes, remind members that their comfort depended on absolute loyalty to the old ways. The cult wasn't evil by nature. It had been created with purpose, with genuine intention to do good in a world that offered few protections to those without power. But it had rotted from the inside, corrupted by members who cared more about control than about the communities they were supposed to serve. Adu watched, learned, and said nothing. He attended meetings, memorized rituals, studied the power structures that held everything together. He saw who held real influence and who simply performed. He learned which fears were real and which were manufactured. And slowly, carefully, he began to understand something his father never had. Power in the cult didn't come from fear. It came from trust. The members who commanded real respect weren't the ones who threatened and intimidated. They were the ones who resolved disputes fairly, who kept their word, who used their influence to build rather than destroy. Adu began to apply that understanding. When conflicts arose, he offered mediation instead of taking sides. When younger members came to him with questions, he answered honestly instead of hiding behind mysticism. When people outside the cult needed help, he provided it without demanding anything in return. People began to notice. Slowly, quietly, trust began to grow around him like roots, spreading beneath soil. Younger members started seeking his counsel. Older members began to watch him with new interest, uncertain whether he was a threat or an opportunity. Kagiso watched him most carefully of all. Months passed before Adu found the documents. They were hidden in a locked drawer in his father's study, tucked beneath old ledgers and business papers that seemed designed to discourage anyone from looking deeper. Financial records, meeting notes, proposals written in his father's careful handwriting. As Adu read, a picture emerged that made his blood run cold. His father had tried to reform the cult. Years ago, before Adu was born, his father had proposed changes to the ancient laws. He wanted to eliminate rules that served no purpose except to instill fear. He wanted to ban the use of cult authority for personal gain. He wanted to transform the circle from a tool of control into a genuine force for protection and justice. The proposals were detailed, thoughtful, supported by examples and precedents. They should have worked. But they had been blocked. Meeting after meeting, vote after vote, his father had been outnumbered and overruled. And then Adu found something that stopped his heart. A letter, written in his father's hand but never sent, addressed to no one in particular. It detailed a betrayal. A member his father had trusted, someone he had considered an ally in the fight for reform, had turned against him, had revealed his plans to the opposition before votes could be called, had spread rumors about his loyalty, questioned his commitment to the circle's survival, had orchestrated his isolation so completely that by the end, his father had no allies left. The letter named the betrayer, Elder Kagiso. Adu read the name 3 times, his hands shaking. Kagiso who had sat in this very study and told Adu his life wasn't his own. Kagiso, who controlled the council with fear and manipulation. Kagiso, who had smiled without warmth and welcomed Adu into a circle he had helped destroy from within. Adu's father hadn't just failed to reform the cult. He had been systematically dismantled by the man who now held the most power within it. The documents revealed everything. How Kagiso had convinced other elders that reform would weaken the cult. How he had used the ancient laws to strip Adu's father of influence, removing him from key committees, blocking his proposals before they could be heard, isolating him from younger members who might have supported him. How he had turned his father's greatest strength, his compassion and desire for justice, into evidence of weakness. By the end, Adu's father had been nothing more than a figurehead, respected in name but powerless in practice. The cult hadn't just inherited Adu, it had broken his father first. And the man who broke him was the same man who now controlled everything. Adu sat in the darkness, holding those documents, and felt something harden inside him. His father had tried to change things and failed because he had done it alone, because he had trusted the wrong person, because he hadn't understood until too late that Kagiso valued power more than purpose. Adu wouldn't make the same mistake. He knew his enemy now, and he knew exactly what he was fighting for. If you believe power should protect people, not terrify them, hit the like button right now. Adu stopped resisting openly. He stopped questioning the ancient laws in public meetings. Instead, he worked quietly, building alliances with members who shared his frustration, who remembered what the cult was supposed to be before Kagiso and his generation twisted it into something else. He studied every ritual, every tradition, every rule that governed the circle. He learned which ones had purpose and which ones existed only to maintain control. He learned who benefited from the current system and who suffered under it. And he began to resolve disputes in ways that undermined the old power structures without openly challenging them. When two members came to him with a conflict, he didn't invoke ancient punishments or threaten consequences. He listened, asked questions, and helped them find solutions that served their interests without requiring submission to authority. People noticed. They noticed that disputes resolved through Adu didn't leave resentment or fear. They noticed that younger members trusted him in ways they didn't trust the elders. They noticed that communities outside the cult were beginning to see the circle differently, not as a threat, but as something that could actually help. Kagiso noticed too. In a council meeting 6 months after Adu's initiation, the elder stood and addressed the room with the calm authority he had perfected over decades. "We have a problem," Kagiso said, his eyes finding Adu across the circle. "Our newest member has been making decisions without consultation, resolving disputes without invoking proper protocols, undermining traditions that have kept this circle strong for 3 generations. Adu met his gaze without flinching. "I've been helping people." "Isn't that what we're supposed to do?" Kagiso smiled, and it was the same smile he had worn that first night in Adu's father's study. Cold, knowing, without warmth. Helping people is what we do when the circle is strong, when fear keeps order, when everyone understands the consequences of stepping outside the boundaries we've established. What you're doing is creating chaos, making people think they don't need the old ways, making them soft. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to Adu, waiting to see if he would back down the way his father had. Adu stood, his voice steady. "Fear is what isolates us. It's what turns us into exactly what the stories say we are. If our only power comes from terror, then we deserve to be destroyed." Kagiso's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Or calculation. "Your father said something similar once," he said quietly. "It didn't serve him well." The threat was clear, the comparison deliberate. Adu felt the weight of history pressing down on him, the ghost of his father's failure hanging in the air between them. But he also felt something else, the support of younger members, the trust of people who had been waiting for someone to stand up to Kagiso's control. "My father was alone," Adu said. I'm not. The power struggle that followed consumed everything. Older members, led by Kagiso, pushed back with every tool at their disposal. They accused Adu of weakening tradition, of undermining the very foundations that had kept the cult strong for generations. They spread rumors about his loyalty, questioned his commitment to the circle. They manipulated younger members, threatened those who supported Adu, used ancient laws to block his initiatives before they could take root. Kagiso was relentless. In meeting after meeting, he invoked precedents, called for votes he knew he would win, reminded everyone that survival required strength and strength required fear. The world doesn't care about fairness, he would say, his voice carrying the weight of decades. It respects power, and power comes from the willingness to do what others won't. Your comfort, your wealth, your protection, all of it exists because people fear crossing us. Take away that fear, and we become nothing. Adu fought back, not with threats but with truth. He exposed members who had used cult authority for personal gain. He revealed how Kagiso had enriched himself while demanding sacrifice from others, how he had manipulated votes and silenced dissent, how he had systematically dismantled anyone who challenged his vision of what the cult should be. He showed them the documents, his father's proposals, the betrayals, the evidence of how Kagiso had built his power on the broken backs of people who had tried to do better. The cult fractured. Some members rallied behind Adu, believing in the possibility of reform, seeing in him the same vision his father had carried. Others clung to the old ways, terrified of losing the power they had spent decades building, convinced that Kagiso's methods were the only thing standing between them and destruction. Meetings became battles. Alliances shifted like sand. Trust became the most valuable and rarest commodity in the circle. And through it all, Kagiso remained calm, controlled, certain that fear would win in the end because it always had before. Adu nearly lost everything. There were moments when he stood alone, when even his closest allies wavered, when the weight of resistance felt like it would crush him. Kagiso orchestrated a vote to strip him of his position, to expel him from the circle entirely. The vote was close, too close. Adu survived by a single ballot, and afterward, in the silence of his father's study, he considered fleeing, taking what he could and disappearing, leaving the cult to destroy itself in his absence. But then he looked at the documents again, read his father's words, saw the hope that had been crushed by a man who valued control more than purpose. If I run, nothing changes, Adu said to himself in the darkness. The cycle continues. Another generation inherits the same poison. Unless I break it now. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the city lights below. Somewhere out there were people who depended on the cult's protection, communities that needed what the circle could be if it stopped being what Kagiso had made it. I'm not running, Adu said to the empty room, to his father's ghost, to himself. Not this time. The cult was collapsing from within. The power struggle had exposed too many secrets, broken too many alliances. Members were leaving, taking their influence and resources with them. Communities that had relied on the cult's protection were being abandoned. The circle was dying, and everyone knew it. In that moment of crisis, something unexpected happened. Both sides, exhausted from conflict and terrified of complete dissolution, agreed to a council. Representatives from the old guard and Adu's reformers gathered in the same room where Adu had first been told his life wasn't his own. They argued for 3 days and 2 nights about tradition and progress, about fear and trust, about what the cult had been, what it had become, and what it could be. Kagiso spoke with all the authority he had accumulated over decades. He argued that the cult's survival depended on maintaining the old ways, that any compromise would lead to weakness, that fear was the only currency the world respected. Adu listened, then stood and spoke with the patience his father had taught him through those hidden documents. He didn't attack Kagiso directly. He simply asked questions. When did fear become our purpose instead of our tool? When did we stop protecting communities and start controlling them? When did we decide that survival meant becoming exactly what we were created to fight against. The room fell silent. Even Kagiso had no immediate answer. In the end, they made Adu an offer, not because they trusted him, but because they had no other choice. The cult was dying, and he was the only one who seemed to know how to save it. "Lead us," they said, "not as our master, but as our head. Show us how to survive without becoming what we fear." Adu accepted, not because he wanted power, but because someone had to try. Kagiso watched from across the room, his expression unreadable. He had lost, but he hadn't surrendered. He would remain on the council, a reminder of the old ways, a living challenge to everything Adu hoped to build. Adu's first act as head of the cult was to abolish the fear-based rules his father had tried to eliminate decades earlier. The ancient punishments that served no purpose except intimidation. The rituals designed to bind through terror rather than commitment. The laws that allowed members to use cult authority to harass civilians and settle personal scores. The resistance was immediate and fierce. Kagiso led it, arguing in every meeting that Adu was destroying the foundations of their survival. "You're making us weak," he said, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had never been proven wrong. "When the world turns on us, when our enemies see we have no teeth, when everything collapses, remember this moment. Remember that you chose compassion over strength." Adu met his eyes across the council table. "I'm choosing purpose over fear. There's a difference." But Adu had built something Kagiso hadn't anticipated. Genuine support from people inside and outside the cult, who were tired of living in fear. He weathered the attacks, absorbed the fury, and held firm. When Kagiso called for votes to reverse the changes, Adu won. When members threatened to leave if the old ways weren't restored, Adu let them go. Slowly, painfully, the cult began to change. Not because Kagiso surrendered, but because younger members who remembered what the circle was supposed to be, refused to let the old ways win again. The transformations didn't happen overnight. Trust had to be rebuilt, one relationship at a time. Communities that had feared the cult had to be shown, through actions not words, that things were different. Members who had profited from the old ways had to be convinced or removed. It took years of constant vigilance, of fighting battles, both public and private, of making compromises that tasted like defeat and standing firm on principles that cost him allies. Kagiso remained on the council, a constant reminder of what could happen if Adu failed, if the reforms collapsed, if fear proved stronger than trust. But gradually, the cult became something new. It still operated in shadows, still maintained its secrecy and its rituals. But the purpose shifted. Instead of using fear to control, it used influence to protect. Instead of hoarding power, it invested in communities. Instead of punishing weakness, it offered support to those who had nowhere else to turn. Adu kept the wealth. That was never in question. But he lost his illusions about what that wealth meant. He understood now that every privilege came with responsibility. Every door that opened for him was a door someone else had helped build. Every protection he enjoyed was maintained by people who trusted him to use it wisely. He was respected but not loved. People feared disappointing him, but they no longer feared him. The cult became quieter, less visible, less cruel. It stopped being the monster in the stories and became something harder to define. A shadow that protected instead of threatened. A force that operated outside the law, but upheld something deeper than legal codes. A circle that bound its members through shared purpose rather than shared terror. Adu understood what his father had learned too late. Power didn't corrupt him because he never mistook it for ownership. He saw it for what it was, a test, a responsibility, a burden that would weigh on him for the rest of his life. He thought often about that night when Kagiso had appeared at his door, when his life had stopped being his own and became part of something larger than himself. He wondered what would have happened if he had walked away, if he had chosen poverty and freedom over wealth and obligation? Would he have been happier? Would he have been free? Or would he have spent his life wondering if he could have made a difference? If he could have broken the cycle? If he could have transformed something rotten into something that could actually do good? He would never know. The choice had been made, and there was no going back. Kagiso eventually stepped down from the council, too old to fight anymore, his influence diminished by years of losing votes to a vision he never believed in. On his last day, he stopped Adu in the hallway outside the council chamber. "You won," Kagiso said, his voice carrying none of its former authority. "But don't mistake survival for victory. The world will test you the way it tested your father, and when it does, you'll understand why fear was necessary." Adu looked at the old man who had broken his father, who had fought him at every turn, who represented everything he had spent years trying to change. "Fear was never necessary," Adu said quietly. "It was just easier than trust, and easy has never been the same as right." Kagiso nodded slowly, something like respect flickering in his tired eyes. Then he walked away, and Adu never saw him again. Years later, when younger members asked him why he stayed, why he fought to change the cult instead of destroying it or walking away, Adu would tell them about his father, about the documents hidden in the study, about a man who tried to do good and was broken for it, about a betrayal that shaped everything that came after. "The cult isn't evil," he would say. "It's human. It reflects the people who shape it. My grandfather built it to survive. My father tried to make it just. I'm trying to make it both. Survival and justice. Power and responsibility. Wealth and conscience." He would pause, looking at faces that reminded him of his younger self, faces full of questions and fear and hope. "The inheritance I received wasn't written in blood," he would say. "It was written in choices. Every generation has to choose what they'll do with the power they inherit, whether they'll use it to protect or control, whether they'll let fear guide them or trust, whether they'll break the cycle or continue it." And then he would ask them the same question the elders had asked him on that first terrible night. "What will you choose?" Adu could have walked away and lived free, or stayed and changed a system built on fear. What would you have done if the price of wealth was your conscience? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more stories where power meets morality, because some inheritances don't come with money alone. They come with choices that define not just who we are, but who we become. Hit subscribe and join us as we explore stories that challenge everything we think we know about power, loyalty, and the weight of the choices we make.